The bet was public. Victoria Lane had made it at a press briefing on the third day, in front of 11 journalists, 4 cameras, and 62 of the most qualified aviation engineers in the country. She had stood at the podium outside Hangar 7 at Lane Aviation Group's private facility in Teterboro, New Jersey, and she had said the words with the specific certainty of a person who has consulted everyone available to her and received the same answer from all of them. She said, $1 million. Cash to any individual or firm that can start this aircraft's engines before the end of the week. The journalists had written it down. The cameras had recorded it. The 62 engineers had heard it, and most of them had looked at the ground, which was the expression of people who had already spent 3 days on a problem, and who understood, from the inside of that experience, that the $1 million was probably safe. The story had run in 4 regional publications by the following morning. By Thursday, day 6, the bet had attracted 200 engineers from 11 countries who had either been working on the aircraft in person or consulting remotely through the diagnostic feed that Victoria's technical director had set up on the second day. The aircraft in question was a Gulfstream G700. Midnight Silver, delivered to Victoria 14 months earlier. The most technologically advanced private jet in the world at the time of its introduction, with avionics systems so sophisticated that the manufacturer had assigned a dedicated technical support team to every new delivery for the first 6 months of operation. It had not started in 6 days. Not because of engine failure, not because of fuel system failure, not because of any of the mechanical systems that 200 engineers had systematically examined, tested, replaced, recalibrated, and examined again. Because of a corrupted initialization file in the avionics software. A file that was 4 kilobytes in size. A file that could be cleared and reset in under 4 minutes by anyone who knew it existed and knew where to find it. Nobody in the hangar knew, except a man who had been walking past Hangar 7 with a delivery box when he stopped. He stopped because of a tablet on a workbench. He stopped because of something his father had written in the margin of a military avionics manual in 1994. And he stopped because he had seen this exact fault before, once on a military aircraft, in 2016, and he had never forgotten what fixed it. Drop your city in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching from today? And subscribe. We tell stories like this every single week. Hit that button. Now let me take you somewhere you did not expect this story to go. Daniel Shaw had a rule about his shop. Nothing on the walls. Not certificates. Not photographs. Not the kind of framed documentation that mechanics and engineers placed on the walls of their workspaces to communicate to clients and colleagues and anyone who walked through the door. The institutional validation of what they had done and who they were qualified to be. The walls of Shaw Avionics and Electronics on Canal Street in Newark were white and bare, and they had been that way since the day Daniel opened the shop 4 years ago. His daughter Emma had asked him about it once. She had been 7 at the time. She had come to the shop after school and had stood in the middle of the main workspace and looked at the white walls for a long moment and said, "Why is there nothing up there?" Daniel had looked at the walls. He had said, "Because the work is what matters, not the paper that says you can do it." Emma had considered this. She had said, "But how do people know you can do it if there's nothing on the walls?" Daniel had pointed at the bench, at the partially disassembled navigation system he had been working on when she arrived, at the diagnostic equipment arranged beside it, at the logbook open to the current job entry. He had said, "They bring me the thing they need fixed. I fix it. That's how they know." She had looked at the navigation system, then at the logbook, then at the walls again. She had written something in her notebook and not said anything else about it. The walls stayed bare. What the bare walls did not tell anyone who walked into Shaw Avionics and Electronics was this. Daniel Shaw had spent 11 years as an avionics technician in the United States Army. He had been stationed at 4 different installations across 2 continents. He had worked on avionics systems in aircraft that operated in conditions that civilian aviation did not encounter, and that civilian diagnostic equipment was not designed to assess. He had developed, across those 11 years, an understanding of avionics system failures that was specifically shaped by the military context environments, where the standard troubleshooting protocol was not always available, where the documentation was sometimes incomplete, and where the fault had to be found by a person who understood the system's architecture well enough to read its behavior, rather than follow a checklist. His father, Raymond Shaw, had been an avionics technician before him. 30 years of military service, 2 wars, equipment that the manufacturers had stopped supporting before the service life ended, and that Raymond had kept operational through the specific combination of deep system knowledge and the willingness to find solutions that the manual did not describe. Raymond had kept an avionics manual from his first posting, a military issue reference document from 1987 that had accumulated, across 30 years, a dense layer of Raymond's penciled annotations in the margins, observations from real faults he had encountered, solutions he had developed, notes that he had written not for any official record, but for himself, and eventually for Daniel, who had read the manual cover to cover 3 times before he was 18, and who carried it in the toolbox of his shop van, the way other people carried first aid kits, not for daily use, but for the situations that the standard equipment did not cover. One annotation on page 214 of that manual, written in Raymond's careful left-handed pencil script in the margin beside the section on avionics. Initialization sequences had stayed in Daniel's mind with the specific persistence of things that turn out to be true across many different situations over many years. It said, "Software lies before hardware fails. Always check the initialization file before you replace anything. The hardware is almost never the problem." Raymond had written it in 1994 after a fault on an avionics platform that had grounded an aircraft for 9 days before Raymond found it in 20 minutes by ignoring the hardware entirely and going straight to the software initialization sequence. Daniel had encountered the same fault category once in his own career. In 2016, on a military transport aircraft that had been grounded for 3 days before his shift supervisor had put him on it. He had found it in 4 minutes. He had written the solution in his own margin note directly below his father's. He drove to Teterboro on Thursday morning to deliver a repaired VOR navigation instrument to a small charter operator in Hangar 3. He parked. He picked up the delivery box. He walked toward Hangar 3. He passed Hangar 7. The door was open. He saw the Gulf Stream. He saw the tablet on the workbench just inside the hangar entrance. He stopped walking. Victoria Lane had not made the bed impulsively. She had made it on the 3rd day, after 2 days of watching 62 engineers produce nothing. After her technical director had told her for the 2nd time that the fault profile was unlike anything in the Gulfstream G700's known fault library, and after the manufacturer's own technical support team had spent 4 hours on a remote diagnostic session and produced a report recommending that the aircraft be returned to the factory for a full avionics system audit. The factory return would take 6 to 8 weeks. Victoria had a charter event and 9 days of private flight for a group of 12 clients whose combined business represented $8.4 million annual revenue to Lane Aviation Group. The event had been planned for 4 months. The G700 was the aircraft specified in the contract. She could substitute another aircraft. She had 3 other jets in the fleet. None of them were the G700. The clients had specifically requested the G700. One of them had flown on it before and had described it to the others as the finest private aviation experience he had encountered. Substituting another aircraft was an option. It was also a statement. A statement about the kind of operation Lane Aviation Group was, and whether it could deliver what it promised to clients, whose expectations were set at a level that substitutions communicated something specific about. Victoria had decided the statement was not one she was willing to make. The bet had been her operations director's idea, offered cautiously on the morning of day 3, as an alternative to returning the aircraft to the factory. The logic was straightforward. The manufacturer's diagnostic process had produced nothing. The contracted specialists had produced nothing. The remote consulting network had produced nothing. The bet opened the problem to anyone in the world who believed they had a solution. It was a long shot. It was also the only avenue that had not been tried. Victoria had considered it for 40 minutes. Then she had walked to the press briefing that had already been scheduled for an unrelated operational announcement, and she had added the bet to the agenda. $1 million. Any individual or firm. Before end of week. She had said it with complete certainty because she had received the same answer from 200 qualified people, and she believed that 200 qualified answers constituted evidence about what was and was not possible. She had been wrong about what the 200 answers constituted. They constituted evidence about how 200 people with the same training approached the same problem. They did not constitute evidence about what all approaches to the problem would produce. The distinction mattered enormously. It would matter specifically on Thursday morning, when a man with a delivery box stopped outside Hangar 7 and looked at a tablet on a workbench. The tablet was showing the aircraft's avionics diagnostic log. 96 hours of fault data, timestamps, system responses, error codes, the sequential record of an aircraft's avionics systems doing something that the engineers monitoring them had been unable to explain. The ground crew supervisor, a man named Pete, who had been with Lane Aviation for 6 years, had left it open on the workbench because he had been consulting it throughout the morning and had stepped away to take a call. Daniel set his delivery box on the ground. He did not ask permission to look at the tablet. He picked it up. He scrolled to the beginning of the log, not the current error state, the initialization sequence from the moment the fault first appeared. He read for 90 seconds. Then, he set the tablet down. He picked up his delivery box. He knocked on the interior door of Hangar 7. Pete appeared. "Daniel, I need to talk to someone about your avionics log." Pete looked at him. Pete looked at the delivery box. "Pete, are you an engineer?" "Daniel, I'm delivering a VOR instrument to Hangar 3. But I've seen this fault before and I know what it is." "Pete, 200 engineers have been on this aircraft for 6 days." "Daniel, I know." None of them looked at the initialization file. Pete stared at him. "Daniel, can I show you?" Pete made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. Not because he was reckless, because he had spent 6 days watching qualified people produce nothing, and because the man in front of him had said something specific, not something general. Not something vague, something specific about an initialization file that Pete did not fully understand, but that Pete's 6 years of ground crew experience told him was either the most informed thing anyone had said in this hangar in 6 days, or the most confident piece of nonsense he had encountered in the same period. He let Daniel in. The hangar was large and well lit, and currently occupied by 4 engineers who had been on the overnight shift, and who were at various stages of a diagnostic session that had been running since 2 in the morning. The Gulfstream sat in the center of the space under the hangar lights. It looked exactly like a functioning aircraft. It was not functioning. Daniel walked to the avionics bay access panel on the aircraft's left side. He did not open it. He went to the avionics terminal on the ground support equipment cart beside the aircraft, the diagnostic interface that connected to the jet's avionics network, and through which the fault had been monitored and interrogated for 6 days. He sat down at the terminal. He navigated to the initialization log, not the fault log, the initialization log. The record of what the avionics systems did in the first 30 seconds of power-up. The sequence that happened before any of the fault codes appeared. He read it. He was quiet for 60 seconds. Then he said, to Pete, who was standing beside him, "The primary and backup navigation systems are running different firmware versions. The update that was performed on day 1 of this fault, the routine software update, pushed new firmware to the primary system. The backup didn't receive it correctly. The initialization sequence starts both systems simultaneously. They conflict at the sync check because they're running different versions. The aircraft safety protocol reads the sync failure as a critical navigation fault and prevents engine start. Pete, our engineers ran full firmware diagnostics. Both systems came back as current version. Daniel, because the firmware version reporting function reads the installed version header, the header on the backup system updated correctly. The initialization file didn't. The header says current. The initialization file says previous. They're in conflict, and the header is what the standard diagnostic reads, so the standard diagnostic says everything is fine. He pointed at a specific line in the initialization log. Daniel, that error. Right there. That's the sync failure. It's in the initialization log, not the fault log. Nobody was looking at the initialization log because the fault codes pointed at navigation hardware. Pete looked at the line. He looked at Daniel. Pete, how do you know this? Daniel, my father wrote it in the margin of an avionics manual in 1994. I saw the same fault in 2016 on a military transport. I fixed it in 4 minutes. Pete said, what's the fix? Daniel, clear the initialization file on the backup navigation system and force a fresh initialization. It'll take 4 minutes. Both systems will sync to the same firmware version. The conflict resolves. The aircraft starts. One of the 4 overnight engineers, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okafor, who had a PhD in avionics systems engineering from MIT, and who had been on this aircraft since day 1, had been listening from the adjacent workstation. She stood up. She walked to the terminal. She looked at the initialization log line that Daniel had pointed at. She looked at Daniel. Dr. Okafor, we weren't looking at the initialization log. Daniel, no, Dr. Okafor, because the fault codes didn't point there. Daniel, the fault codes pointed at navigation hardware. The initialization log is a separate diagnostic layer. It's not part of the standard fault monitoring protocol. Dr. Okafor, it's part of the military avionics diagnostic protocol. Daniel, yes. She looked at the terminal for a long moment. Then she looked at Pete. Dr. Okafor, let him fix it. Subscribe right now. Because the next 4 minutes in this hangar are the reason this story exists. Hit that subscribe button. New story every week. Daniel asked for 2 things: a direct avionics terminal connection with write access to the backup navigation system's initialization partition, and 4 minutes without anyone asking him questions. Pete gave him both. The write access took 90 seconds to authorize through the ground support equipment. Pete had to call Victoria's technical director, a man named Marcus, who had been the operational point of contact for the 6-day diagnostic effort and who answered Pete's call with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing a crisis for 6 days and who processed Pete's request that a delivery driver from Newark wanted write access to the avionics initialization partition of a $75 million aircraft in approximately 5 seconds before saying, "Give it to him." Marcus had been on this problem for 6 days. He had nothing left to protect. Daniel had the access at 9:41 in the morning. He navigated to the backup navigation system's initialization partition. The partition contained 3 files. He identified the corrupted initialization file in 11 seconds. It was the only file in the partition whose modification timestamp did not match the update log from the day of the firmware push. The header had been updated. The file body had not. The conflict was exactly where he had told Pete it would be. He deleted the file. He initiated a fresh initialization pull from the primary system's correctly updated partition. The backup system accepted the pull. The sync verification ran. Both navigation systems reported identical firmware versions for the first time in 6 days. The initialization conflict resolved. Daniel looked at the system status display. Green across the board. He looked at Pete. Daniel, start it. Pete looked at Marcus, who had appeared in the hangar in the past 2 minutes he had driven from the office building, on the far side of the facility, the moment he had authorized the right access. Because he understood that whatever happened next was something he needed to be present for. Marcus looked at the aircraft. He looked at Daniel. He walked to the cockpit access ladder. He climbed it. He sat in the left seat. He ran through the pre-start checklist at a pace that communicated he was not going to skip any step, regardless of how much he wanted to know whether Daniel was right. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. He initiated the engine start sequence. The Gulfstream G700's 2 Rolls-Royce Pearl 700 engines spooled up. Not one of them. Both of them. In the specific sequential authority of 2 engines that had been waiting 6 days for the avionics system conflict that had been preventing them from being asked to run to be resolved. The sound filled the hangar. Dr. Sarah Okafor, Ph.D. in Avionics Systems Engineering from MIT, 6 days on this aircraft, had been standing at the avionics terminal watching Daniel's screen during the 4-minute process. She watched the sync verification complete. She watched the status board go green. She heard the engines start. She sat down, not on a chair, on the floor of the hangar. She sat down on the floor of Hangar 7 at Lane Aviation Group's private facility in Teterboro, New Jersey, and put her hands on her knees and looked at the running aircraft and did not say anything for a moment. One of the other overnight engineers, a man named Carl, who had replaced 2 navigation system components in the past 3 days, at a combined cost of $84,000, looked at the running engines, and then at Daniel, and then at the avionics terminal screen, and then back at the engines. Carl, the initialization file. Daniel, yes. Carl, we didn't look at the initialization log. Daniel, no. Carl, because the standard protocol doesn't include it. Daniel, the military protocol does. The military operates aircraft in environments where the standard protocol is sometimes insufficient. The initialization log was added to the military diagnostic sequence in 1993 after a fault that grounded an aircraft for 9 days. My father was the technician who found that fault. Carl looked at him. Carl, your father. Daniel, he wrote down what he found. In the margin of a manual. In 1994. I read it when I was 16. I saw the same fault in 2016 and fixed it in 4 minutes. I recognized it on your tablet in 90 seconds this morning. Carl looked at the floor. Carl looked at the $84,000 worth of components he had replaced. He looked at Daniel. He said nothing. Marcus climbed down from the cockpit. He walked to Daniel. He extended his hand. Marcus, the technical director of this operation, just authorized a delivery driver to write to the avionics initialization partition of a $75 million aircraft based on a 90-second conversation. Daniel shook his hand. Marcus, I'm not sure whether that was the best or worst decision I've ever made. Daniel, the engines are running. Marcus, yes. They are. Victoria Lane was at a press conference when her phone rang. Not her public phone, the one her assistant managed and filtered. Her direct line. The number that 3 people in her organization had, and that she answered regardless of what she was doing, because the 3 people who had it did not call it for routine matters. Marcus was calling it. She was mid-sentence in her response to a journalist's question about the status of the $1 million bet, her third question about it, in 4 minutes. The press, having developed a specific appetite for the story when the phone in her jacket pocket vibrated with the specific pattern she had assigned to Marcus's number. She held up one hand to the journalist. She answered. Marcus said 4 words. He said, "The jet is running." Victoria stood at the podium in front of 11 journalists and 4 cameras and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then she said, to the journalist whose question she had been in the middle of answering, "I need to excuse myself." She walked off the podium. She was in her car before her assistant had reached her. She drove to Teterboro. She walked into Hangar 7 at 10:26 in the morning. The Gulfstream's engines were still running. Marcus had kept them running because Victoria had said when he called her that she wanted to hear them herself when she arrived. She stood at the hangar entrance for a moment. The sound of 2 Rolls-Royce Pearl 700 engines at idle in an enclosed hangar is not a quiet sound. It is the specific contained authority of $75 million worth of engineering, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Communicating in the only language that engineering ultimately speaks, not documentation, not specifications, not the diagnostic reports stacked 4 inches thick on the workbench, but function. The simple, complete, undeniable fact of a thing working. Victoria had not heard that sound in 6 days. She walked into the hangar. She looked at the aircraft. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Dr. Okafor, who had gotten off the floor and was now at the avionics terminal reviewing the initialization log with the specific focused attention of someone who was going to understand exactly what had happened before she spoke to anyone about it. She looked at Carl, who was sitting on an equipment case with the expression of a man accounting for $84,000 in component replacements that had not been necessary. She looked at Pete. Pete pointed at Daniel. Daniel was at the workbench. He had packed his tools. He had his delivery box, the original delivery, the VOR instrument for Hangar 3, which he had set on the ground outside Hangar 7 2 hours ago, and which Pete had brought inside when it became clear that Daniel was not going to be completing his Hangar 3 delivery on schedule. He was writing in a small notebook, not documenting the repair. He had already done that on the terminal, leaving a complete written record of the fault identification and resolution process in the aircraft's maintenance log. He was writing something else. Victoria watched him for a moment before walking over. He looked up when she was 4 feet away. She said, "You're the one." Daniel, "Yes." Victoria, Marcus told me on the phone, a delivery driver. Daniel, avionics repair shop. Canal Street, Newark. I was delivering a VOR instrument to Hangar 3. Victoria, and you stopped. Daniel, I saw the tablet. I recognized the fault from the initialization log. Victoria, in 90 seconds. Daniel, I've seen it before. Victoria looked at the running aircraft. She looked at the workbench. She looked at Daniel. Victoria, the bet was public. Daniel, I know. Victoria, $1 million. I said it on camera. Daniel, I know. Victoria, to whoever fixed it. Daniel looked at her steadily. Victoria, you fixed it. Daniel, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not the discomfort of someone being reminded of an obligation. The specific thoughtful quality of a person who is about to have a conversation that is going to go somewhere different from where they expected it to go when they walked through the door. Victoria, I'm prepared to honor the bet immediately. The funds can be transferred today. Daniel looked at the notebook he had been writing in. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at her. Daniel, I don't want the $1 million. Victoria looked at him. Daniel, I want something else. She waited. Daniel, I want to tell you about my father first, because what I want is connected to him, and I don't think you'll understand what I'm asking for unless you understand where it comes from. Victoria pulled 2 equipment cases from the side of the workbench. She sat on one. She gestured at the other. Victoria, tell me about your father. Raymond Shaw had joined the Army at 19, not because he lacked other options, because he had grown up in a household where money was specific and limited, and where the military represented the specific combination of education, training, and income that his circumstances did not otherwise offer. He had been assigned to avionics maintenance on the basis of an aptitude assessment that identified his spatial reasoning and his mathematical ability as specifically suited to the work. He had arrived at his first posting with no prior aviation experience, and had spent the next 30 years becoming one of the most respected avionics technicians in his service branch, not through rank, though rank came, but through the accumulated recognition of supervisors and colleagues who had learned that if a fault could not be found by the standard process, Raymond Shaw was who you called. He had kept the manual from his first posting for 30 years, not because it was required, because it was the document that had been his introduction to the systems he would spend his life understanding, and which had become, across 30 years of marginal annotations, a record of that understanding, in a form he could pass on. Daniel had inherited it. He described it to Victoria the way he described most things without embellishment, with the specific accuracy of someone communicating facts that mattered, rather than constructing a narrative that impressed. The manual. The annotations. Page 214, and the note from 1994 about the initialization file. His own note, below it, from 2016. Victoria listened. When he finished, she looked at the avionics terminal, where the backup navigation system's fresh initialization file was running cleanly in sync with the primary. Victoria, your father wrote the solution in 1994. Daniel, he wrote the observation. I applied it in 2016. I applied it again today. Victoria, and you want to pass it on. Daniel, that's what I want instead of the $1 million. Victoria, tell me specifically. Daniel, a funded avionics training program. 2 young people per year from Newark, from the neighborhood around my shop, who want to work in aviation. Real training, not observation. Real aircraft. Real systems. Real diagnostic work with real accountability. A 3-year commitment that gives 2 people per year an actual pathway into aviation maintenance certification. Victoria, 2 per year. Daniel, my father trained 2 junior technicians at a time across his career. He said the knowledge was worth nothing if it stopped with the person who held it. I have been the next person it stopped with for 11 years. These positions are the next movement. Victoria, the program would run through Lane Aviation. Daniel, through Lane Aviation, with access to your aircraft, your facility, and your existing maintenance certification infrastructure. I provide the technical curriculum. You provide the environment. Victoria, that's worth more than $1 million over 3 years. Daniel, no, it's worth exactly as much as the 2 people per year who come through it. No more. No less. Victoria looked at him for a long time, not performing the consideration, actually considering it the specific process of a person who makes large decisions regularly, and who applies to this one the same quality of assessment she applied to the ones that appeared in her financial reports. She said, I accept. She extended her hand. Daniel shook it. Then she said one more thing. He waited. Victoria, the $1 million. Daniel, I said I don't want Victoria, I know what you said. I'm not offering it to you, I'm offering it to the program. As the founding endowment, 3 years of 2 positions per year at full aviation maintenance certification standard costs money. I'm the reason this problem existed for 6 days. The endowment is the appropriate accounting for that. Daniel looked at her. Victoria, you fixed my aircraft in 4 minutes. The least I can do is make sure the knowledge that fixed it goes somewhere permanent. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My father would have considered that a fair arrangement. Victoria, good. He picked up Emma at 3:15. She performed her assessment before her seatbelt was on. Emma, something happened. Daniel, yes. Emma, something big. Daniel, yes. Emma, did someone pay you $1 million? He looked at her. Daniel, no. Emma, did you fix something worth $1 million? Daniel, I fixed something. The $1 million went somewhere else. She thought about this. Emma, where? Daniel, to a program. 2 people per year from our neighborhood will learn avionics. Real aircraft, real work, real pathway into the industry. She was quiet for a moment. Emma, because of Grandpa's manual? Daniel, because of what Grandpa wrote in the manual. Yes, she looked out the window. Emma, so Grandpa's note from 1994 fixed a jet in 2026, and now it's going to teach people for the next 3 years. Daniel, that's an accurate summary. She picked up her notebook. She wrote, for the length of 3 traffic lights. She showed him at the next red light. It said, Grandpa wrote 1 sentence in 1994. Dad used it twice. Now 6 people will learn it. By 2030, those 6 people will teach others. 1 sentence in a margin. 32 years. How many people does it reach before it stops? Below that she had written her own answer. It said, it doesn't stop. He read it. He looked at the road. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, your grandfather would have liked you very much. Emma, I know. She closed the notebook. They drove home. The first 2 avionics trainees started at Lane Aviation Group 8 weeks later. On their first day, Daniel gave each of them a photocopy. 1 page. Page 214 of a military avionics manual from 1987. His father's annotation in the left margin. His own annotation below it from 2016. And below both of them, in Emma's handwriting, the words she had written in the car on a Thursday afternoon in June. It doesn't stop. He told them to put it somewhere they would see it every day. Both of them pinned it above their workstations. Neither of them asked why. They already understood. Daniel Shaw's avionics training program completed its first cohort 14 months later. 2 people, one of them a 20-year-old named Marcus from 3 streets off Canal Street, passed his FA avionics maintenance certification on his first attempt and was hired by a regional aviation firm the following week. On his first day, he opened the manual his supervisor gave him. He turned to page 214. He read the margin note. He recognized the handwriting. He called Daniel that evening and said, it's in the manual they gave me here too. Daniel said, your grandfather's knowledge has a long reach. Subscribe now. New story every single week.